Since you're the host, Matt, I'll let you monitor the inbounds.
Sounds good.
Got some people rolling in. What's going on, Aaron? Osreen, Howard. Got some people rolling in. All right. Welcome everyone to Matt and I's first Dancing with Elephants webinar. We'll get going in just a second. I'm going to play the interviewer today because Matt's kind of the expert on Dancing with Elephants. Specifically, we're talking about the large software incumbents, so the Procores, the Autodesk on the real estate side, the Yardis, the multifamilies. Can be a complex environment to navigate. So that's kind of the topic of today. Matt, while we're kind of waiting for everyone to roll in, when we talked about this webinar in terms of just preparation, one of the interesting things that I found to be pretty fascinating about just the environment and how like the open software movement has shifted just in the construction space and in the real estate space just over time. And we actually thought it would be helpful for everyone to kind of get a historical perspective just on, kind of the history of the open access movement. Do you mind like kind of walking people through like high level basics of what, when that happened and what that looked like?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's helpful to start by looking at it even outside of real estate construction. We get the pleasure of being in a laggard industry, as we all know that, sometimes we feel like, why are we doing this to ourselves? But the industry, tends to underspend on R&D. So, I think it's helpful to look at kind of the broader technical perspective and then how construction and real estate have kind of caught up to that. So, I think if you go back to, around the 2000s, the early 2000s, this is kind of when by and large, when kind of data integration and the need for APIs and connecting systems started, right? Prior to that, you're using mostly desktop programs, you're using, God forbid, green screens, spreadsheets, a lot of paper processes, right? So around the 2000s, you start getting players coming to the market with, web-based software. A big one, I think, Salesforce, launched their kind of API product, and they were one of the kind of pioneers, right? They launched around the 2000s. Even Procore and whatnot, they started, sometime in the early 2000s. But still at that time, it wasn't necessarily that we were integrating data, right? Things had moved from desktop to the web. I think that's important. But it was really kind of farther along in the 2000s. You started to hear about things like SOAP and XML-RPC, right? These were our first kind of network-based, web-based API things that popped up. And then came along the service-oriented architecture buzzword. I was working at a startup in around the 2005, 2008 time, right? This is when this came like super big. Like everybody was talking about service-oriented architecture and SOA and all this stuff, right? It was like the biggest buzzword, and literally, I don't think anyone knew what it meant. I think it probably ranks up there for me as one of the larger, more meaningless buzzwords in the software world that I've ever experienced. But nonetheless, right, this is kind of where it's almost a precursor to microservices that you see now, but it's kind of like where this thought of integration really started getting driven from. And I feel like it was pushed a lot by enterprise software players because suddenly things were moved from paper. People saw the value of data and saw the value of being able to integrate, these new kind of web-based systems, and this was now a possibility. So I feel like it really kind of pushed pushed along kind of this idea of integrations. And then of course you get to, the 2005-ish timeframe, you start get the iPhone comes out, you start getting mobile apps. Obviously, with mobile apps, you need APIs, and then you move past that. We're kind of to the today timeframe. You've got very heavy JavaScript front-end frameworks. Again, these all run off of open APIs. So it's a really interesting kind of progression if you look at it through the industry, or through the time outside of the industry. I think if you start looking at the construction industry and real estate industries now, you can kind of see where those things fit in, right? Like Procore came along in the 2000s. I'd say it wasn't until very recently Procore kind of stepped up their game with their kind of API ecosystem. When you look at kind of the design side, Autodesk and whatnot, it's been very hard to have APIs and integrations on the design side because it's so file based. So I think the advent of BIM becoming more and more popular, I think has pushed that along a lot. But it's just been historically very difficult on the design side to get any kind of integration, just because you're opening up Revit on your desktop and you're saving a file to your hard drive and you're sharing that file. So it's just from a technical perspective, it just makes it very difficult to do anything with it. And I think very recently, things like Forge and BIM 360 have obviously helped push that along a lot. Although I think there's still some questions, around the kind of long-term longevity of the technical solutions of things like Forge. But yeah, that's another topic for another day. But yeah, I mean, hopefully that's helpful as kind of an introductory history lesson on APIs.
Yeah, no, I most definitely learned something from that history lesson. So just really quick, Miguel asked, do we have representatives from Elephants on this call? We don't. Matt and I are speaking kind of as the outside third-party authorities on the topic. And actually the reason is, maybe in the future we will, but the reason is like we actually wanted to just kind of lay out the landscape before we had any biased parties come into the conversation. I think like just having an unbiased perspective about what's actually happening. Like, look, Matt and I have no skin in the game here. We probably, if we're biased anywhere, it's towards the startups and wanting to create a kind of a more even playing field for startups and wanting to give them a roadmap for how to integrate with these players. So again, like I think the purpose of this conversation is to, if you're a startup and you're considering how your strategy is going to work with a Procore, with an Autodesk, or if you're on the real estate side with a Yardi, with a RealPage, there's a lot of factors that need to be addressed, and you need to understand their strategic approach to truly back out like what you should be doing and how you should be working with them, in our opinion. And so we kind of laid out two key components to this conversation. One is like most basic tech and product stuff, which is like, how do you integrate? How do you integrate with some of these players? How do you work with them from a tech and integration perspective? And the second piece is like, there's potentially the obvious incentive for why you do this is it could become a great channel for you if you integrate. There's customers on their platform. It could be used as a great customer acquisition tool or a feature for your product, not just a feature for theirs, right? So wanting to think through like relationship wise, and this is like, I guess, other than me being an unbiased, non-technical person interviewing Matt and helping the masses understand like how integration actually works with these players. But from my perspective, like how relationship wise and go-to-market wise, you should be thinking about your strategy and how you can leverage them and how to build a relationship with these guys, because they can ultimately be valuable. It's just it is certainly a strategic game, and you have to weigh their incentives versus your own in many of the scenarios. So that's kind of just a level set for this conversation. That's kind of what's going on here. And yeah, we've honestly been excited to address this for a while, because it can be very opaque. I think for a lot of startups that we've spoken with, the instant a customer says, "Hey, are you integrated with Procore?" You feel the need to go integrate with Procore, and you haven't really thought through the next steps and what that ultimately looks like for your business. So I think hopefully we can provide some transparency around what that looks like. And so, yeah, I guess, Matt, to toss it back to you, in terms of the first part of the process, which is like actually going in and, like, let's say you're deciding whether or not you should be integrating. How do you think about strategically with your technology and with your product, the value of making a decision to move forward with integration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question. More often than not, it's tends to be driven by customer requests. Especially the earlier stage you get, you're just not necessarily thinking about how do I go in and from the beginning integrate with Procore. It's more like you're out in the sales cycle and somebody says, "Hey, we need you to be integrated with Procore," and then it's a very reactionary, kind of knee jerk reaction that you have, and you go in and then integrate. I think strategically there's some interesting things that you have to think about. One being, if you're from the start, if your business model revolves around being integrated with an incumbent, you have to think about from a venture fundable, at least, not all businesses have to have venture funding, obviously, but we're a little biased seeing as how we come from a venture firm. So from a venture funding perspective, if your business is dependent on that integration, is it a good business model, right? Because the problem, of course, is if you're completely dependent on Procore and they decide they don't like you anymore, can they turn you off and have you suddenly lost all your business, right? So I think that's a super important thing. And not that we necessarily see that, with Procore. I think on the multifamily side with Yardi and RealPage and those guys, it's a much, they tend to be a little less friendly, right? For whatever reason, they have tended to shy away from this kind of ecosystem approach. They all say they do it if you go to their website. But if you look at the differences, let's say I want to go integrate with Procore, I can literally go to their website, I can sign up for an account, I can start working on the same with Autodesk, right? If you transition to the multifamily side, to the real estate side of things, it's much more opaque. You fill out a form, somebody contacts you, you go through negotiation about what kind of data you need. They have a huge fee to access the data. It can be tens of thousands of dollars per year to get access to some of their APIs. They, lock you out, limit which APIs you can call and what kind of data you can get back. And it's just a very different process, right? So those guys tend to just be a little less friendly to startups, and it's actually it's a prohibitive cost. I think one of our startups, they pay RealPage, it's $20,000-$30,000 a year, just for access to the API. And on top of that, the APIs that they provide are very antiquated. They're very old school. I know I was in there helping them do some work on those APIs, and I was like, this is embarrassing. Like, I would be embarrassed if I was Yardi and I was in charge of this. I was the product owner for this. I would be freaking embarrassed to present this to somebody for outside use. It's that bad, right? So it can be a challenge, and to pull somebody off of core product build and say, go work on this, Yardi integration, because we have a customer in the sales cycle wanting to, needing it for integration. It can be a huge distraction, right? It can take weeks to get the integration right. So that's weeks of somebody who should be working on core product having to go transition over to do integration. So it's really tough. Unfortunately, I don't feel like the nut has really been cracked in our space. I think there's some players in other industries, like MuleSoft and Delbumi, for example. Those guys do a pretty good job with other softwares of providing that integration layer and kind of handling the nitty gritty details of making the integrations work. But I don't feel like in construction that we've really gotten that solution yet. Boomi does some, and obviously the big players are connected in there, the Procores and the Forges of the world, right? They're all connected. But I feel like for a lot of our kind of startup point solutions, there's a lack of that. There's really a gap there. And I think that's super important, especially as we move into kind of this post-COVID world, right? Whatever that looks like, with things tightening up, with construction companies, margins were already bad. If things tend to, dry up a little bit, if there's a drop in building activity, the question is really going to become, as a CIO at a construction company, how can I ink out that little bit of productivity with my API strategy, with my data strategy, and tighten things up, right? And I think that's going to be a question that comes up more and more. Everybody's trying to cut costs, so it's like it kind of makes sense that it falls into that category, right? Like integrations and connecting our different systems is going to be the next round of being able to squeeze dollars out and do more with less resources. So I think it's important as a startup to keep that in mind, right? And basically, I think that's what that means is, as you're in your sales cycle, if it's an enterprise sales cycle, you're going to have to answer the question, A, how does this product save the company money? And B, how are you going to fit into our existing enterprise stack? Because we can't go and hire a team to manage implementation of this product and babysit it, right? So it's got to fit nicely into our existing enterprise stack, and be able to work with our existing tools.
So you're saying in the COVID environment, in a potential recessionary environment, you think it's actually going to be more common for customers to request integrations in some of the bigger platforms?
Yeah, I do. And I think it'll be more common for them to request that they're already done. Not even so much that it's
that's the expectation.
Hey, yeah, it's the expectation. It's not like, oh, we can go do that, give us 6 months, start using it, give us 6 months and we'll go build it. It's like, no, we need it. We need to start using it. We need that integration done now, right? So I think that's good. I think from the standpoint of building a modern technology from scratch, I think startups actually have a huge advantage there. Like if you're new to the space and you're coming in just starting building, like technology has shifted such that it's almost, when we build, it's almost the norm now. Like if I talk to a startup for diligence, they'll say tomorrow and they don't have an open API, I'm like, what the hell are you doing anyway? It's really kind of the expectation from a technical perspective, even now, as well as business perspective. So I think it gives the startups actually quite an advantage to be able to have the APIs and have the tooling in place to be able to make those integrations easier. Rather than if you look at a legacy software that's been around for let's say 10 years, they may or may not have those kind of APIs in place today.
So I think might be helpful to kind of break up this conversation. I think the real estate side is one component. And by the way, Howard, I just saw your comment. Saw we had a couple questions come in from Chris and Miguel too. If you feel free to keep sending them in, we'll address them. Matt and I had just some core parts of the conversation we wanted to cover first. And then we'll kind of save the questions to the end just for organization purposes. So yeah, keep sending them in. Thank you. And then, anyway, I think it'd be helpful, Matt, to separate the real estate player conversation from the construction side. So we definitely came to the conclusion that the construction and design side, and by the way, we're kind of speaking there mainly right now in terms of Procore and Autodesk Forge and Procore's kind of growing ecosystem of point solutions and integrations. Clearly they're a little bit more open-minded and they're a little bit more forward-thinking in terms of how they're strategically working with companies to build on their platform. Most have dedicated resources internally, either a point person or even teams that are working on this initiative. And I know that Procore has certainly modeled their ecosystem approach after Salesforce's. And so I was curious, like, can you give people an understanding of how Salesforce's model worked, and maybe what Procore is trying to create on the construction side? So for any construction tech startups, like how they should be and by the way, Autodesk is not excluded from this example, how Forge and Procore's ecosystem are kind of working towards building a better technology environment with integrations.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting if you think of Salesforce, they have a really unique kind of model, and honestly, they're one of the only companies I know that have done this well, and that you can actually build an entire solution on their platform, backend, UI, like all of it, basically entirely on top of their platform. But I think is super interesting. There's obviously a lot of technical challenges there. It is by far not an easy feat. But you know, I think it's really interesting. I think if you look at Procore, you know, that's not quite what they're doing. They're more loosely saying you can go build a solution on your own and then integrate it, you know, back into Procore. But it's less of like, you can almost think of Force.com as this like all-encompassing ERP solution, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where it's like a one-stop shop for, you know, you need your CRM, you need this, you need that. Like, it's just all in one place. Yeah, I don't think Procore is really doing that. And I think for good reason, because I think it's hard. I also think if you look at the development dollars that Salesforce has spent, it's massive, right? To be able to create that kind of very flexible,
Right.
I mean, it's almost like their own, you know, programming language in a way, right? So
Right.
it's a lot of R&D spend to build that. Yeah, so I think Procore is like a step under that, and Autodesk as well, right?
So if you're a construction tech startup, just knowing that they're not quite on the same page as Salesforce in terms of what they're trying to build, rightfully so, but they are open-minded and receptive, and they are committing resources to growing this ecosystem. How do you think about like, what would be your recommendations on how to think about them as a potential channel, and then some of the trade-offs from what we were speaking to before, with actually devoting resources to and taking people off core product to go integrate?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, as a startup, I would suggest not thinking about them as a channel. You know, like, you need to go out as an early stage startup, go out and do your own sales without having a channel. I think that's honestly one of the only ways to do it. I think once you have a repeatable product that you know the market has accepted, and that you know provides value, and that you can very accurately and succinctly provide a value prop to somebody, that's when you can start leveraging a channel strategy, right? And I think Procore and their kind of app store or whatever, Autodesk as well, like that app store model fits better. But until you can succinctly sell somebody what your product is and what it does and why it provides them value, like, you're going to spend a lot of time building this kind of integration, and nobody is going to buy it. So I think we're very, especially at Shadow, we're very kind of adamant that channel strategy as a first sales strategy doesn't work. You really, by and large, you need to be out there selling it yourself.
So I think one of the things that we talked about that kind of encompasses this is, in terms of mentioning the importance of having a cohesive product strategy related to some of these integrations. The strategy isn't saying, I'm going to build a feature for Procore. If your strategy is, I'm going to build a feature for Procore, you kind of know how that's going to end. And being reliant, I mean, the other just key strategic thing to keep in mind is, like, anytime you're reliant on one specific, I mean, this is what you're speaking to channel strategy, but anytime you're reliant on one specific channel, you're putting yourself at risk, right?
Right.
There's just substantial, there's technology risk. Like if the platform goes down, there's risk on, from a sales perspective. Like what if Procore sales drop, your percentage of sales drop? Like you're not creating your own destiny.
Right.
And I think that's kind of the core thing. So really,
Right.
the two things that we laid out was you need to Procore should be a feature for your customers. And if
Right.
you're addressing that question, then that is one aspect of like, yes, maybe I should, if Procore is a feature for your customers, they're asking for it. Then that's one thing. The second is, you need to be able to prove that the channel is going to help you acquire customers. Once everything else is set up, right?
Right. I mean, think of it. I think you can think of it this way. If I go out and I build and I call up Yardi tomorrow and I'm like, hey, Yardi, I want to build XYZ, and I need to use your API to do it. And the value of you building that entirely rests on Yardi customers basically hooking into it. The problem with that, of course, is that it completely devalues your company. I mean, if you get a ton of traction, say you get millions of users, you're killing it on revenue, like what is Yardi going to do? They're going to look at you and they're going to be like, well, who's this joker? Like, why is this guy over here building a product and making millions of dollars dependent on our platform? Like, why would we let that happen, right? So they're going to come to you and they're going to say, here's what's going to happen, Nick. You got this great product that's entirely dependent on our API. We're going to buy you for pennies on the dollar, because if you don't let us buy you, we're going to turn your access off and we're going to kill you, right? So you completely devalue yourself, right? And I think even if you're split between providers, if you're agnostic, let's say you go to Yardi and RealPage, like I still think that's a huge problem, right? Because even if one of them does it to you, you've suddenly lost 50% of your revenue. So I think you have to be really, really, really careful as to getting yourself into that position, and really understanding what makes you valuable outside of that kind of integration.
Yeah. So I mean, it begs the question, right? So if you're an early stage startup, there's kind of a chicken or egg thing, right? So you don't have any customers. You have very few customers. You see this large incumbent platform that has all of your potential customers on it, and the question is like, what's more important? Is it me building my own defensibility, devoting energy to my core product, which frankly isn't really validated yet by the market. So that's a problem. And so is it an iterative thing? Like, can it be iterative where, you essentially test out and do some market validation there?
Yeah. I mean, I think it can, right. And I don't think I'm advocating for, always building over buying. There's obviously a time and a place for that. Especially as a startup, but you have to really look at, what's providing the most value for me, what's quickest to get to market, and then what's a good long-term strategy, right? And those things can all be thought of differently. You don't necessarily have to take all of those in one go. And I think to your point, if I'm building a product around BIM and I need a viewer, like, am I going to go build my own viewer? Like, no, hell no, that would be insane. But if I get traction in 2 years down the road, like, then will I go and build my own viewer? Like, maybe, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe. Mm-hmm. So I think you have to really think of it kind of in both short term and long term, because it's, as an early stage startup, our biggest problem, our biggest risk is always running out of money. So what gets me from point A to point B the fastest to let me prove value, to be able to create a repeatable, sellable product, with a good repeatable, model, and then kind of have a longer term vision, of that down the road.
Sorry, I had some internet issues there. So now I guess let's transition a little bit. So you have your strategic decision to integrate or not integrate. on the real estate side specifically, and I know Miguel had a question around the kind of the economics and the business models and how a Procore and Autodesk would make money from the integration. But I mean, we talked specifically about Yardi and RealPage, and Yardi charging a pretty good penny to work with them. What would you recommend? So play out that customer scenario for someone, so that in the startup example that you mentioned, let's say they're paying 30 grand to integrate with Yardi. They decide to move forward with that integration because they think that customer contract could be greater than, 30 grand, 60 grand, whatever it might be. So there's like long-term value there. What other decisioning goes into that, right? Like, is there a scenario where if you have money on the table and someone says yes if you integrate, is there a scenario where you actually should turn them down?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to look at those costs, and I mean even the cost of development, right? I mean, that's a lot of times that's even that's greater than the API access fee, right? I mean, 30K sounds like a lot, but if you have to have a developer focus on it for several months and then ongoing support, I mean, it's going to cost you significantly more than 30K, right? So I mean, I think there is a scenario where you turn it down, but I also think those are going to be few and far between moving forward. Like I just I had a conversation with the CTO at one of the larger GC in the US, right? And I mean, that was his comment. It's a precursor to do business with us. You have to integrate into our enterprise stack. Like, it's almost a non-starter. Like, it has to happen, right? So I think there are opportunities where you'll say, no, we're not going to do this integration. I think generally, especially with the bigger incumbents, like it's going to become necessary at some point.
For sure. Yeah. Okay. So back to, let's, I guess, discuss for a quick second. Like, you decide to integrate, your business is in a good place. Like, you validated that you can actually generate revenue from them, but you're not dependent on the incumbent. What are some of your recommendations for how to partner with them strategically? Because there is a dance, right? There is a dance of working with them to show them that you're bringing value to the ecosystem and the community, that you care about this long-term relationship, right? You might get some extra, and like there will be added benefit probably to that scenario. So what are your recommendations with how to work with those incumbent teams, and how much energy should you be devoting to that?
Yeah, so I'd say first and foremost, leverage your customer's relationship with them where you can. And I think that probably applies more to the Yardis and RealPage of the world than the design construction side. But what I mean by that is, let's say you're super early, they're quoting you whatever $50,000 for API access. You absolutely just can't afford it. Like, you just don't have the money. Go to the customer who wants that and be like, give them a call. Like, help me negotiate this, right? Like, you guys need this. You're already paying, who knows, God knows how much money, per year for their service. Like, help me negotiate this, right? And I've seen that tactic work a lot. And obviously, the bigger that customer is, the more pull they have, obviously. So I think you can get pretty far with that. The other thing I'd say is get creative. Early stage, get creative how you use their APIs. Things tend to be priced on a kind of API, like an individual API basis. So if you need access to resident data but not unit data, whatever, right? Those are all priced individually. So each one that you add on costs more. So be creative with what you need kind of at this point, and how you can maybe piece some things together, and that kind of thing. On the design side, a lot of things with Forge tend to be priced on a kind of per request basis. So, if you need to open and render a BIM model, like it's every time you make that request, right, it can be an additional charge.
Right.
So obviously be careful with that, because those charges can rack up very quickly, especially if you have, it's easy to make a typo or, a mistake in your code, and then all of a sudden your requests are going through the roof, right? And you're on the hook for paying those. So obviously be careful with that. But also just, be cognizant when you're doing the integration of ways that you can reduce that cost or cut things down, right? And that's why I think also people tend to think, oh, integrations, like it's a secondary task. It's not core product, right? Which that is all 100% true. Most of the time it's not core product, but at the same time, you can't just, they're generally just not, I don't ever suggest to people to just kind of shrug it off and like let the intern do it. That generally comes back to, it generally comes back to bite you in the ass, right? So I'm pretty adamant about, really thinking through technically the long-term integration strategy, and how you're going to make that work over the long term, and really thinking of the ramifications. We don't have to get into it on this call, but thinking through the ramifications of, how you're storing data, how you're syncing data, how you're using the API is, what happens if the API goes down, what happens if you go down, as data suddenly, dropped or lost or whatever. So I'm a pretty big proponent of thinking through those questions.
So, what I get from that answer is, so basically, if you're committing to doing integrations, like do it right, don't half-ass it. And then second part is, when you're working with some of these incumbent teams, to grow your relationship, and you're working with them, whether it's on a specific client or multiple clients, leverage them, right? They probably have a point of leverage that you're not pulling yet, and don't be afraid to ask for their help on that. I think that goes, so that's a great point. And in terms of the strategic relationship building with them, I would really, they do have dedicated resources for this. They all do. I would really try to lean on those teams as much as you can, and not just asking, and look, it's a relationship. So you have to give things. And I think showing interest is one aspect. There's plenty of startups who are not devoting enough energy. They're having their intern do the integration. There's no relationship there because they're mad, or because they don't view it as a priority. If you actually commit to the relationship, you actually might see some dividends paid long-term in terms of them prioritizing build for you, them working for you to increase some price leverage. There is significant value there. Probably,
I think,
go ahead, Matt.
I think that's a good point. But, and if you think about it, there's a reason why Autodesk devotes so much resources to their developer network. It's important to their long-term product strategy, right? Otherwise they wouldn't give you 24/7 free support as a developer. They wouldn't run monthly accelerators that are completely free, that you get 2 to 3 full days of training from their experts, right? So they want, for those guys at least, they want to help you. I think on the multifamily side it can be a little different, but those guys especially, they obviously see it as important to their long-term product strategy. And I think somebody like Autodesk, who grows through acquisition, like when is the last time Autodesk built something in-house? I don't even know, right? Like they totally grow through acquisition. So for them, even for them to maintain that growth and to be able to make smart acquisitions that actually work together, that integration strategy for them is huge. So definitely, I would say definitely leverage them. For people that are in our startups, we have a lot of those relationships in place. So we already know people it's their job to make startups successful on their platform. So if you're not getting the support you need from them, with the people that you're in contact with, definitely, reach out to us, and we can try to help connect you with the right people as well. I think that's important.
Yeah, definitely. So you've mentioned a couple of times the multifamily side being a little bit more difficult.
Yeah.
Can you hypothesize why they are not as open-minded, why they're not as, I guess, creative and more forward-thinking with building an open ecosystem?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny. So we had a quick chat before, before our call, me and Nick did, talking through this, and I felt like he asked me that and I didn't have a good answer. I've thought about it since, and I still honestly don't have a great answer. It is a little baffling to me why they're just so closed and just painful. I mean, it's just painful to work with. I think it maybe just boils down to a cultural thing within their organization. You've got the Autodesk and Procores and the big players. I mean, they're all West Coast companies. They're, they try to be forward technically. I think their culture is just one of being a technical solution, rather than a business solution,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like if you think of the people who work at Autodesk, I'd imagine if you talk to their developers, they're very proud of the solutions that they're creating from a technical perspective. I think if you were to talk to the development team at Yardi, they maybe wouldn't be. I'm speculating a little bit there, right? But I would imagine that that's probably the case. So I think it's just, I mean, honestly, it's a big cultural difference within the organizations. I think it probably mostly boils down to that. And I think long-term vision, like, I don't know, what's the long-term vision for a Yardi and a RealPage? Like, I don't know. I can't really answer that. I think if I looked at an Autodesk or Procore, I can see that a little bit more clearly.
Mm-hmm.
So I think a little bit comes down to defensibility. They're being defensive around their products, probably because they're not super technical. I mean, there's nothing that a Yardi is doing that's super interesting technically, right? So their business strategy is it's more based around being defensive and trying to kill people from a business perspective rather than trying to kill them with their technology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Makes that, I mean, I think that's kind of on point. That would be my assessment too. Actually, so Howard has a relevant comment here. So as a former RealPage employee, I can tell you that getting internal APIs are as difficult as those for external clients due to an extremely siloed organization. Many multifamily vendors will start out creating APIs with open source vendors such as Entrada, Restman, etc. Then embracing having APIs with outside sources. RealPage and Yardi are leery to work with potential competitors. So I think that's on point.
Right.
Like, look, I mean, RealPage and Yardi are leery to work with potential competitors because they're trying to be they're both trying to be monopolies, and working with competitors in most cases, if you're a monopoly, is not just the strategy that you're you're executing. That just doesn't go hand in hand. Culturally, yeah, that's awesome. I think I mean, look, the culture aspect to this dynamic is, I think it's going to be really interesting over the coming years, actually, because where they go through, I mean, you just said, like, I don't really know what their plan is long term, right? Like, at some point, it's going to make sense for some solution to come along, embrace the open source architecture, and as the real estate technology ecosystem grows, like, if you have this plethora of solutions that can integrate with this open source platform, probably a way better solution than Yardi's, excuse my French, but shitty software and architecture, right? Like,
Right.
at some point, those people get displaced, right? And
Right.
you have to wonder when that's coming. But for now, like, I think they're both pretty defensive just because of how it's going to play out in the short term.
Right. And I think also, I mean, if you look at them as a company, I have never in my life heard one person say, I, in any way, shape, or form, have enjoyed any interaction I've ever had with these companies.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, they're that bad. They're hated that much by their clients, which I think is very interesting. Obviously there's tons of, the space is ripe for disruption, right? I think the problem is, yes, they have a monopoly. They make it hard to get their data out, right? So even if you were going to switch, the question kind of becomes how, as an end user, as a customer, how do I do that? How do I switch from one of these solutions to another, because they lock down the data, right? So the switching costs are high. Even if you think of the multifamily with how embedded it is in all of the different properties, right? I think it's tough. It's a tough nut to swallow from a business case to say, I'm going to switch off of this, because there's all the data you've got to get out, all the training that has to be done, all of that good stuff, right? And across all of your different properties, all the different property managers and teams on the ground. So I think it's tough, but obviously I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't think that space was ripe for disruption. But I think all the signs point to it. It's just a matter of execution.
Yeah. Slow, gradually, then suddenly. That's right. What I was going for. Right. Okay, we have some questions. So just with about 15, a little less than 15 minutes left, let's run through these. So Chris Bowles, how can a startup know their concept is not stolen or copied by the elephant when asking for a partnership? Does that not happen by NDA, et cetera? That
is a great question. Yeah, carefully. But I mean, I think the end scenario here is you have to be very careful, because I mean, at the end of the day, especially somebody like Salesforce, right? Like you're literally creating code on their platform, and they're kind of, Salesforce uses like a kind of bastardized version of Java, right? But you're literally uploading that code to their platform. I mean, they have access to it. They have 100% have access to your code. So could they go in and steal it? Like, yeah, they could. Reputationally, they're probably not going to do that, right? That would be a lot of shit they'd be in if that started to get out, and they got that kind of reputation. They could basically kiss their strategy with integrations and partners goodbye. Like no one would do it anymore. So I think that's interesting. But on somebody like a RealPage or a Yardi who aren't there, that's not part of their long-term strategy. Like, yeah, you better believe that they're monitoring what you're doing. Like, you better believe that if you start to get traction, you absolutely have to. If you start to get traction, like they're looking at they know which APIs you're calling. They know how you're, receiving and sending data, right? They can, in some way reverse engineer what you're doing with the integration, right? So so you better believe that they're gonna be looking at that. And I think that just goes back again. They can kill you in several ways. Turning off your access is one. Replicating what you're doing is another. But I think that's something to definitely not get sucked into. And there's no way that there's just no way you're going to contractually be covered with a Yardi or RealPage. Like, they're not going to sign something that's going to restrict them. Like, it's just not part of their kind of cultural DNA, right? So it's a great question.
So Miguel has a question about business models. Do you happen to know the economics that Forge and Procore use?
So Forge is it varies based on the API you're using. I think a lot of them are pay per use. So like if you need to render a model, you'll pay a couple pennies, whatever, per render. Procore, I actually don't think they charge anything for their API. I could be wrong about that. But I think it's kind of included as an end user, as a customer to Procore. Like, you get API access. It's a truly open API, right? So you get access along with that. So you essentially, as an end user customer are you're authorizing kind of the developer or the app to be able to use the API on your behalf. So it's totally free. And I think a lot of Autodesk APIs are the same way. But some of their probably more compute heavy things are they charge for.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah. So Ian validated that in the comments there. So Greg, when we were talking about the 30K API, we were actually talking about Yardi. That's not Procore.
Those are rough numbers. We don't know what the real numbers are, because you have to negotiate with them for every API you want. So one person could pay 30K, another person could pay 5K. Like, it just, it's all an open negotiation with those guys. I'm sure they have base pricing, but it's definitely not cheap. We do know that.
Yeah. Miguel had another question. Great investments on developer networks from Procore, PlanGrid, and Forge. PlanGrid, of course, is now within the Autodesk ecosystem. So that's another interesting dynamic. Do their Salesforce get trained? Does their Salesforce get trained on extensions availability? How do they bring you on their deals? Mostly when you own your own go-to-market efforts, have they created that lead for you?
Yeah. So I think that's a great point. And yeah, the answer is, if you're early on, if you can't articulate your value prop to a customer succinctly and accurately, there's no way that a Autodesk, Salesforce person is going to be able to do it, right? So it's really up to you to be able to define that and articulate it to an end customer. And then I think once you do that, and once you can do that repeatably, that's when you're going to start seeing, possible referrals from the Salesforce of the incumbent. But until you do that, yeah, no, I've never seen it. I've never seen that work in the opposite in the opposite way.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So Greg Howard has a question. Procore contacted us to integrate because they have a hole in resource management. Is this normal? We did not contact them. I'm weary to integrate at this stage because we are too early.
Yeah, no, I've actually seen a couple. I have known a couple startups who have had that happen. And I would say, if they're reaching out to you, yeah, for sure, like, take it seriously, because if they have identified a gap, in their functionality that they're trying to fill, then yeah, the chances are that if you can do that correctly, that yeah, they're going to bring you some business. So I would definitely say, take it seriously. I would caution, if you don't feel your product stands on its own yet, it may or may not be the right time to do that with an external partner, because ultimately you might get sucked into this kind of relationship, and then all of a sudden your product doesn't exist without Procore, right? You're spending all your time and resources doing that. So it's it's an interesting balancing act.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I would say that, and if you think you're too early to integrate, I'd say you're probably right.
Right.
Like you should feel like, before you have before you have a really strong footing in terms of discovering product market fit, and just having enough initial customers to know that feature request to be on Procore is real, and is actually going to generate you revenue. And it doesn't sound like, Greg, you're in that scenario. I think like, it's kind of a no-brainer, like focus on product, and focusing on build and getting product market fit. I don't think, again, I think integrating too early it's a time waster, between getting to market, and getting some early validation for what you're doing. So Chris, go ahead.
But I do think it kind of depends on what you want. Like, what do you want your company to be, right? Like, look, you can make a company completely dependent on Procore or Autodesk or whatever. You can make a Revit plugin that you sell for $100 a pop, right? And like, you could build a decent business from that, right? It could be millions of dollars a year in revenue, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. But what do you want from your company? Like, is that what you want? Like, do you want to be at best, a $3 to $5 million per year revenue company? Or do you want to grow faster, right? And be that 100 million, unicorn, whatever, right? So I think it's important to think through that. I also think thinking through your cash position is important, because again, like, running out of money is the worst thing you can do. So if I had to say, do you want to go integrate with Procore too early, or do you want to run out of money? That's a decision you have to make, right? So if that's what you have to do, that's what you have to do. If that's not the kind of company you want to build, then maybe, running out of money is okay, and you can go, get a job somewhere. That's fine too. But it's thinking through all those things, right? Like, so I don't know that it's necessarily as easy as saying like yes or no. If you're at this point, you should or should not integrate. But it's thinking holistically, like, what's this going to do for my company and my valuation and my cash position, in the short and long term, and thinking through all of those with what you want.
So hopefully that answers your question, Chris Bowles too, which his question was, when is too early to integrate? So hopefully, yeah, I think that's a perfect answer. Does anyone else have any questions? Feel free to put them in the Q&A or the chat. We got a couple minutes left. Before we, I guess while we're waiting for any final questions, Matt, do you have any parting thoughts about what might be interesting for people who are trying to figure out this topic, do a little bit more research? Like, where would you point them to learn more?
Yeah, I think I kind of go back to what I said before. Like, every conversation that I've had with larger GCs in the past, 2 months have really pointed to this need of integrating. Like, integration is step zero. Like, if you don't support it, you're not going to get very far with an enterprise sales cycle. You might be able to sell, one-offs for projects. But bigger picture, like, you're not going to get anywhere with the enterprise as a whole. So be cognizant of that, and make sure you can at least be prepared to answer those questions in the sales cycle. I'd say that's kind of my takeaway from the recent advice. In terms of resources and whatnot, reach out to us. Like, we can connect you with the right people. Some of them make it easy, like Autodesk. Like, those guys are very good about kind of publicizing their events and offering events and offering resources. But yeah, reach out to us. We can help point you in the right direction. I've worked with most of these guys in some way, some form or capacity in the past. So I might even be able to kind of point you to certain resources, or give you some general guidance on it. I'm happy to do that.
We had a question come in from Nick Freeman. Can you address the convergence between EE in the built environment and advanced M&V pure plays?
I don't know what any of that means.
Yeah, Nick, do you mind being a little bit more specific? Just even with your acronyms. Oh yeah, energy efficiency.
Here's the convergence between energy efficiency and the built environment and advanced M&V pure plays. I honestly I don't have a lot of knowledge in that space. I think unfortunately, I'd have to pass on that question. Sorry.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, we can, Nick, if you want to get more specific about that, we can shoot us an email. We'll drop it in the chat for everyone if anyone wants to follow up as well. Ohlman. Cool. Okay, well, that I think wraps us up. We are out of time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for hearing Matt and I just chat back and forth about how to dance with elephants and some of the challenges that you might have integrating with some of the bigger players in the space. Look, I think the key takeaways, it's a big decision, right? So be thoughtful about it. Value yourself and value your future business that you're trying to create. Those are kind of some of my key takeaways. And be open-minded, like even with people like Yardi and RealPage. I think the trends over time are they're going to have to work with you all. The startups are creating a lot more value, and they're going to be a growing importance for their overall strategy. And with seeing players like Autodesk, who was once closed, kind of have a more open ecosystem, I think is perfect validation for that. So be flexible. If they're rude to you, know that's normal. You all will figure it out over time. But yeah, again, thank you for listening in. Shoot us an email if you have any questions.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Cheers.